Welcome to the Public Company Series podcast powered by Onboard, giving boards the clarity, security, and insights they need to make better decisions and deliver lasting value. I'm your host, Doug Chia. This podcast series is designed to give corporate directors, executives, and governance professionals the insights and tools they need to build boards that are agile, resilient, and prepared for the future. It's based on the book Board Structure and Composition, which is part of the Public Company series published by the New York Stock Exchange and JP Morgan. Our guest for today's episode is my longtime friend, Paul Washington, President and CEO of the Society for Corporate Governance. Paul authored the chapter of the book entitled Balancing Workload and Responsibility of the Board and Its Committees. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Doug. Delighted to be with you.
So the underlying challenge that Paul addresses in his chapter of the book is that the three-committee structure that may have become out of date given the challenges that boards face today. Public expectations of what boards are supposed to be overseeing keep growing, yet committee design has largely stayed frozen. Paul raises the question whether the commonly accepted structure of board committees and their respective responsibilities match the kind of decisions, risks, and demands that companies face today. In the chapter, Paul walks us through how this seeming misalignment developed and why simply throwing new issues into existing committees is less than ideal. He offers a clear step-by-step process for boards to reassess where committee work is done and where it should be done. So, Paul, with that, let's take a deep dive. If you look at the committee structure of a public company, it's always the same three: audit, compensation, nominating governance. How do we get here?
It's a great question. Yeah, those three committees exist at about 99% of public U.S. companies. And how did we get here? We got here because of the Enron and WorldCom crisis, and then the stock exchange listing standards that were adopted in response to that over 20 years ago. And so the notion at the time, the analysis of the problem at the time, was that there was a lack of effective independent board oversight of misbehaving or self-interested management at Enron, WorldCom, and other companies. And so the idea was to have three committees composed entirely of independent directors who are independent of management, who would oversee or make decisions in key areas. So first, the financial statements and oversight of the auditor. Well, that was given to an audit committee. Second, executive compensation. Well, that should be decided by independent directors with no ties to management. And third was the Nominating Governance Committee, where you wanted to have a committee that was independent of management and chose directors who are also independent of management. So the whole notion here was these three committees are necessary to provide independent board oversight of potentially self-interested or misbehaving management.
Some of these committees actually existed before, like Audit Committee, I think did.
Correct.
But it was still populated by not all independent directors, but still a lot. And boards themselves had a lot more non-independent directors.
That's right. And yeah, there was precedent for all of these types of committees before. So it wasn't just coming out of whole cloth, but the stock exchange listing standards codified the requirement to have those committees or something like them, and that they all be composed of independent directors. And they provided in the listing standards what those committees were supposed to do.
So it's fair to say you see this current setup as leaving some big gaps.
Yeah.
In the chapter, you point out, nowhere do the listing standards address the board's or committee's roles in either a decision-making or oversight role in strategy, operating, or capital plans, budget, capital allocation, or in key areas such as the company's technology, workforce, facilities, public policy, and so on. Let's talk a little bit more about that in terms of the gaps that you've identified.
The gaps here lead to a lot of frustration by boards and members of management over and over again You see management thinking that the board's not really doing its job, and you see boards expressing frustration with their board materials and the meetings and so forth. And I think there's something that sits beneath all of that, which is there is a desire, certainly by directors. These are some of the smartest, most experienced people in corporate America. They want to do more than sit on a nanny state board that's overseeing the decisions made by someone else. They want to, at a minimum, be strategic thought partners and engage with management in thinking through the company's activities in the marketplace, the products and services it sells and it buys, in the workplace, its operations and its workforce, and in the public space, its communications, its government policy, and so forth. So there's a real desire by directors to be engaged more thoroughly. Now, management sometimes doesn't want the board to get into those interesting areas, but a lot of folks in management do actually say, we'd like our board to add more value in those areas. But both at the board corporate governance guidelines level and at the committee level, those fundamental business areas are just not addressed and have in many cases remained unaddressed for 2 decades.
I guess one way to look at it is that those are just understood. It's like, yeah, a board's there for, to advise on strategy. And we brought these board members in to help us do certain things. And those are like more business type things. And so we don't really have to write these down. So maybe by not writing them down in the rules, the uninitiated types out there, they just read the rules and they're like, oh, this is what these guys are supposed to do. And it doesn't mention anything about strategy. So, like a lot of lists, you only think about what's on the list. You don't think about what's not on the list.
Right. And that leads to a lot of frustration by directors. Like that's when they talk, we're just a check the box board, and they don't want to be. But if something's written down as required, then all the governance professionals out there will make sure the board and the committees all do what's required, but they may not step back and say, do they do what's required by regulation? And maybe not what's required or advisable in terms of running business. I did a poll at a conference not long ago where I asked how many people in the room had their board actually vote on their corporate strategy versus review their corporate strategy. Literally only 2 hands went up in a room of about 200 people who said the board voted on the strategy.
Yeah.
That can be okay. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I am saying that there's also a lack of clear definition of what is the board's role with strategy. Does it vote on it? Does it just review it? What counts? Board review. And I think that's one of those areas, and we can get into the committee structure aspect of this, but if you don't have that clarity, it can lead to calamity. So at Lehman Brothers, for example, if you read the bankruptcy examiner report there, it said the board's responsibility was to review risk tolerance levels. Well, the board regarded that as, well, management sets them and we just look at them. And management regarded it as the board approves them. And so that sort of lack of clarity, the lists you said, that can lead to real problems because it's not clear who's got the ball.
Yeah, definitely. So when I look at the traditional board committee structure, they're the 3 committees that everybody knows about. Let's just call them the big 3. This occurred to me when a couple of years ago, to mark the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's death, or was it the 50th of that New York Times magazine piece, whatever it was, all of a sudden the whole idea of shareholder primacy was being kind of trashed. And people, including me, were saying that we need to bring back the stakeholder model. Employees, customers, community, and shareholders too. And if everything should balance out, but it shouldn't just be like, let's just think about the stock price. And then I was thinking, okay, if that's the case, then shouldn't the committees also be addressing each of those constituents? And when you look at each of the 3 committees, they don't. They really only protect the shareholders' interests. The audit is looking at after the financial statements. Comp is really, at the time, was only looking at executive comp and not the rest of the employees. And the nominating obviously was really there to populate the board. I obviously see this as kind of a problem. I don't know what's your take on this?
It's a great question. So look, my own view is that companies have a fair amount of latitude under the law to decide where they want to be on the sort of Gordon Gecko to tree hugger spectrum, right? They have to still serve the interests of the corporation, right? The board has to serve the interests of the corporation and its shareholders, right? But in doing so, they can take into account a lot of other stakeholders in that process. I think there's a fundamental issue here that committees are part of, which is first, the boards have to kind of talk about in the context of their own strategy and their own corporate culture where they want to be on that spectrum, right? And then the second thing is they need to figure out how to bring different stakeholder perspectives or impacts or relationships, because there are many ways you can think about stakeholders. You can think about them. Do we have a good relationship with them? Are we serving their interests? Are we responding to their most recent requests, right? There are a lot of different ways you can think about your stakeholders, but you ought to bring some version of that into corporate decision-making. So how does it play out at the committee structure level? Well, we have seen committees take on responsibility for certain stakeholders. So the compensation committee now often oversees the workforce at some level as well. So that's employees. You have seen nominating governance committees take on responsibility for philanthropy, community relations, sometimes public policy, or there may be a separate committee there. So you've got that. And then the audit committee occasionally gets enlisted into reviewing things like ESG reports. So that can be a multi-stakeholder endeavor. The issue is that each of those winds up being kind of siloed, right? And so those stakeholder perspectives do not actually roll up into broader corporate decision-making. So I think part of the issue here is if you're going to take more of a stakeholder perspective, you have to have a way of not putting these in committee cul-de-sacs, but actually integrating stakeholder perspectives throughout your decision-making process. And committees can be part of that. They should facilitate that, not actually send dead ends for employees. Well, we look at them at the Comp and Human Development Committee, so we don't really need to consider them any other time when we're doing an M&A transaction or when we're doing our budget or anything else like that. I think that's where committees can actually stand in the way of taking into account stakeholder perspectives and impacts.
I think we know that the law allows companies, like in an M&A deal, to consider other stakeholders, but companies usually take, the safest route is just shareholder primacy. So if we just do that, we're fine. If we start, introducing other factors, then we'll get sued and so it's like, we don't want that. So let's just take the path of least resistance and then call it a day. The other thing about the committee structure is that everything it addresses, everything that the charters address, are really defensive. It's about risk mitigation, right? And these three committees, Audit, Comp, and Nominating Governance, they don't address opportunity. I think you and I have been on not-for-profit boards that have strategy committees. When was the last time you saw a public company have a strategy committee? So what do you think about this kind of notion of maybe there should be like an opportunities committee? It's like the business
It's a
committee.
great observation. I think it's a great observation because I agree with it. Now, I had a conversation with a CEO I worked with, and he just talked about the natural incentives for corporate directors is to protect their own reputation because they don't usually have enough money at stake. So what's really at stake for directors is their reputation. So that naturally will make them more risk averse, right? Management has more money that they can make by taking advantage of opportunities, so they're going to be a little more aggressive. Our committee structure reinforces that risk-focused predilection among directors. And I think that that is, in fact, a real issue. Because if you're thinking about the transformative trends that are affecting corporate America, whether it's technology and generative or AI, or it's sustainability, or it's economic shifts with tariffs and so forth, you need to have a board that is not only focusing on the risk, but focusing on the opportunities. I wrote a piece on this where companies ought to have an enterprise opportunity management system, not just an enterprise risk management system. So, and at the board level, and what does that mean in terms of committees, which is how do you enlist the full board and its committees in as a constructive partner in developing, approving, or reviewing and overseeing the implementation of the company's strategy. Now, the issue is that's something management loves to have full say on, right?
Sure.
And yet, if you view the board as a strategic asset, right? If you're paying these people a decent amount of money to show up a few times a year and consult with them throughout the year, you kind of want to make sure you're getting the most out of them. And so I think that it's a really big opportunity out there for companies to look at their committees and say, okay, how can they help us more fundamentally execute our strategy, which is not just the risk side of the equation, because frankly, that puts everyone to sleep. No one wants to spend all day talking about risk, but enlist them on the opportunity side, which is really what gets the blood flowing.
Yeah, so I guess some people would say, okay, well, that's what they call a full board issue. But I think to me, everything's a full board issue at the end of the day, right? And so, going back to this idea of a strategic planning committee, there's nothing stopping them from creating another committee that's populated by board and management. So it's like this other type of committee that's just a blend.
And you're right, by the way, that not-for-profits actually tend to have more of those sorts of committees. So, for example, I lead the Society for Corporate Governance, right? And we have committees that directly relate to our, call it business activities, right? One of the things we do is we advocate on the public policy arena. So we have a policy advisory committee. One of the things we do is provide educational programs and conferences and online programming and so forth. We have an education committee, right? And then we also have, on the revenue side, we have membership and we have sponsorships. And so we have a membership committee that looks at all of that. So we actually, because we also have an audit committee, we have an executive committee that serves as a comp committee, but because we're a not-for-profit that looks to maximize the value of our board, right? We actually have committees that enlist our board in helping us think through core business areas.
And then so the board is not just approving or reviewing, they're actually involved with the creation of the strategy.
Absolutely.
So companies have tinkered with their committees over the years. But the way they've done that is usually by expanding the scope of an existing committee, usually the audit committee. There's that pile-on effect. And nobody wants to serve on that committee as a result, to take on whatever like the issue du jour is, cyber, crypto, AI, whatever. But that's just shoehorning new things into, what feels like, okay, which of the three committees is like close enough that we, or these guys have more time when their meetings, we'll just give it to them. But in the chapter, you identify that something bigger is going on here. Let me just read from it. It says, it reflects a widening gap between today's imperative that the board and committees serve as strategic thought partners with management in guiding the direction of the corporation, and the more limited role of the board and committees codified in the stock exchange listing standards adopted over 2 decades ago, which focused on the board's responsibility for independent oversight. So, this gap kind of goes back to balancing, the board's 3 main roles: advisory, oversight, monitoring. But as we're talking about, a lot of directors complain that, okay, this is like too much monitoring going on. And it just takes up all of the agenda. And then we see in the public, where was the board? Why didn't they prevent any bad thing from happening? Is that just kind of like where we are today?
I think it's actually always been what boards could be doing and used to do when they were more composed by non-independent directors. And then we've swung in the favor of independent directors. They focused on independent oversight, but that's led to a ton of frustration. It's also led to, some big court cases that said the board wasn't paying attention to the business side. And so I think what you've seen is, interesting, something like 74% of the S&P 500 now has more than 3 committees, right? So they've added some additional committees. As you said, they've shoehorned some issues into existing committees. And I'll give you one that actually concerns me a lot, which is people have given responsibility for ESG or sustainability to the Nominating Governance Committee. Now, if you take sustainability seriously, So you take environmental, social responsibility seriously. You think that it can be a competitive advantage for your company. Why would you put those issues, which are fundamental business strategy issues, under the Nom and Gov committee, which may have no experience in sustainability matters, right? Sure, they got the G in ESG, but if you're looking at reducing carbon emissions, or you're looking at protecting biodiversity, if you're looking at fair wages and fair labor conditions, which is the number one sustainability issue for CEOs and consumers and employees alike, why would you give that over to the Nom and Gov committee? So there is a real mismatch these days where people have just dropped stuff into committees without, as we'll get to, I guess, and I talked about in the chapter, taking a step back and taking a more back to basics fundamental analysis of what do we want committees to do and where can they add value? If you go through that analysis, I think it could highlight some real opportunities, maybe not to do a complete overhaul of your committee, but at least make some more meaningful and thoughtful adjustments to their remit.
Yeah, and as you point out, you throw something into a committee. Have you actually thought about who is on those committees? Is the makeup even appropriate? Or are you going to kind of adjust the makeup to what you just gave them? And so, I mean, nowadays I see people shutting down the ESG and sustainability committees for various reasons. So we'll see if it goes back to that at some point. So, you mentioned the mismatch. So in the book, you say, for all these reasons, the fundamental mismatch between the roles of the board and the required committee structure, the resulting gaps that can cause losses and lost opportunities, and the suboptimal attempts to fill those gaps is at least arguably worth boards taking a fresh and comprehensive look at their committee structures. So, how do you suggest you do that? I think you have 5 steps.
Yeah, I'm a lawyer, so I like to number things. And, so I think the first thing you do is you look at existing board and committee responsibilities together, right? Because sometimes people look at each committee in a silo. They don't even look at how that matches up against the board responsibility. So you can say, okay, what do we currently enumerate in our governance documents that the board and committees are supposed to do? You do that inventory. That's pretty straightforward. But then step 2 is the biggest one, and we can talk some about this. That's when you consider how the board and committees could add value, the potential ways you could add value, right, through committees, whatever those committees may be. Then you conduct a gap analysis between what could the committees be doing for us, that's step 2, versus what do we have now, that's step 1, right? That's the gap analysis. Then the 4th thing you do is you say, okay, in light of all that, let's have a defined committee structure with the responsibilities that go along with it. And step 5 is you develop and implement a plan to get there. So it's pretty basic, but I think this is a time to go back to basics.
Yeah. And in the book, you spend most of the time or a lot of the time on step 2, consider how board and its committees add value, which, I don't think people think about committees as adding value. I think they think about them as, okay, we just got to do this kind of thing.
Right. And so if we focus on step 2, and really is the critical one, this is where the hardest thinking, but in some ways the most fun thinking happens. And for those of us who like to think, this is the enjoyable stage, right? So I think the first thing to do is you think about, and let's think about it into context of executing company strategy. So company strategy is essentially executed in 3 broad areas: in the marketplace, the workplace, and the public space. So the marketplace are the products and services you sell and those you buy upstream, your supply chain. The workplace, well, that's your employee base, but it's also your operations. And the third thing is the public space, and that's your communications, your government affairs, your corporate philanthropy, and so forth, right? So those are the 3 areas in which you execute your strategy. And then you say, okay, that's great. Map that out. And then you say, okay, well, how can committees add value with respect to those areas? And there are a few ways committees can add value. The first is they can review stuff before it goes to the board. So you vet some issues before they go to the board. That's fine. That helps the board in its decision-making role. The second thing is they can provide heightened oversight. right? So we really pay attention. We're drilling down so someone else doesn't have to, regardless of whether it goes to the board. The third thing committees can do is they can make decisions. And then fourth thing they can do, which is really important, like in the area of strategy, is forge a consensus when there's disagreement. So what you want to do is you want to do a matrix. You want to do a chart that looks at those three areas of activity, and you look at those ways the committees can add value, and you figure out what the committees ought to be doing. So let me give you a concrete example to bring that to life. So let's say AI is going to have a transformative impact on your firm, and you want to be ready for it, right? You want to have a committee structure that enables you to adapt to that. So AI is going to have an impact on the marketplace. It's going to affect the products and services you sell and you buy. Let's say you're a movie company. It's going to have a big impact. It's going to have impact on your workplace, on your operations, on your workforce, right? And it's also going to have an impact on your public policy, likely, right? So it's going to have a big impact. So what do you want committees to do? Do you want to have a committee that reviews your AI marketplace activities in advance before it goes to the board? Or do you want to have it at least provide heightened oversight? Do you want to forge a consensus? So you can go through and say, okay, here's the big issue that we're facing. How does it play out in these three areas? And then where can committees add value, right? And so what you may wind up saying is, okay, we want to distribute AI responsibilities across committees, but we're going to be very clear about it, that your role is to provide oversight in this area, like your human development committee, your comp and human development committee is going to provide heightened oversight of AI's impact on your workforce. You could do that if you wanted to. Or you could say, I want to have a standalone AI committee, right? Temporarily, perhaps, to forge a consensus on AI strategy. So, but you go through it and you think about what are the fundamental areas that you're trying to address with your strategy, and how do committees, given who they are and how they operate, how can they add value? You develop a map, and that gives you a sense of what should our committees actually be spending time doing, not just what's in the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ listing standards.
Yeah, so I think AI is a great example to look at in terms of, for the Nominating Governance Committee, kind of technically or, charter-wise, there's not that much AI they're looking at. The Audit Committee is kind of like, okay, let's oversee risk,
Right.
because they oversee risk of everything.
Right.
Enterprise, risk management, that's definitely part of it. And then comp, which is now expanded in even most companies to cover workforce.
Half of the S&P 500.
They are thinking about, okay, what do we do about, what's all this talk about? It's going to replace half of our workforce. Is that true? How do we adapt to this, that, and the other thing? But the blind spot is like, where's the opportunity, right?
Right. It leaves open. It leaves completely unaddressed. What are the business opportunities in the marketplace? The products we sell and and those services that we buy. What are the opportunities in the marketplace? What are the opportunities in our operations? Now, some banks particularly have operations and technology committees, but what are our opportunities with our operations? And, and what should we be doing on public policy? So those whole areas are missed. And so a good question is, okay, would it be useful to have a committee add value in either forging consensus, doing pre-review, or heightened oversight in any of those areas to help us out, right? And so you're right. It's a good example of highlighting where there are current gaps. And you can go through almost every area. It's not just the emerging areas like technology and sustainability where you can figure out there are gaps, but it could be core business ones where, supply chains, people paid a lot of attention to supply chains during the pandemic. They're still not entirely satisfied with where they've come out. But do you want a board committee or some way, or have the board or someone look at supply chain issues, which are going to continue to be a hot button in the area of increased tariffs, right? So that's the kind of stuff that may be sort of core everyday business stuff, but maybe, at least ask the question, would it be helpful to have a board committee to look at that as part of some of other responsibilities?
And I actually think a lot of directors would love that.
Yes.
It's like, committee to look at, kind of the prospects of AI in our business. I want to be involved in that. Now, people say, well, then it just makes it a whole board issue. But I don't think the whole board is looking at it in that kind of like deep dive type level. And it can't, right?
It can't. And because there's only so much time, and that's why committees exist, right? Because they give you, boards only have so much time where you can sit there paying attention to things before people zone out. So you have to allocate responsibilities to other committees so they can spend more time on it, right? And that's the advantage of pre-review. It's the advantage of having a committee that does that, or heightened oversight. So you're right. A lot of boards would love to do that. Now, of course, management might say, okay, but boards.
Yeah. Slow down here. Yeah, everybody take it easy. Yep.
Right. But what this does is it doesn't necessarily, rethinking your committee structure in this way does not necessarily result in redrawing the line between the board and management's responsibilities. Management can still do everything that it wants to do. It can propose and so forth. But even if the board is in a relatively, and board committees are in a relatively passive role, Bob Clark, who former dean of Harvard Law, served on our board at Time Warner, where I worked for 20 years. And he wrote just about the salutary benefit of having board or committee oversight simply because it forced management to do a better job thinking things through.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
even if you don't draw the line any differently, having a committee or having the board look at something, you got to sharpen your thinking. You also have to do it on a particular schedule, right? So it can help management do a better job, even if the board has a fairly light touch.
Yeah. It has a way of making it a priority for you if you know at the next meeting they want to discuss this, which they said at the last meeting.
Right.
I think this really goes back to what we were talking about in terms of kind of today's role of committees, how they were looked at, maybe even how they were created, because this is like, oh, it's Sarbanes-Oxley, kind of creation of that. And it's the mindset that these are not committees to get creative with. These are not collaboration committees. These are really oversight monitoring committees. If you don't do certain things, there are consequences. There's supposed to be consequences. I want to see a report on all of the bad things that happened or gaps or employees that were padding their expense reports and that kind of stuff. And that's no exaggeration. So I think, it does go back to this mindset. But there's nothing stopping anyone from sitting down. Let's, just for funsies, start with a blank sheet of paper and see what this would look like if we could just create this thing, in our own laboratory instead of the New York Stock Exchange's laboratory.
There isn't anything legally stopping people from doing this, but there are reasons why they don't do it, right? The first is that it takes time to do this, right? And to do well, it takes senior executive time. It takes some real thought. And it takes a level of trust that if the management comes up with something, the board is going to be able to responsibly carry out its expanded responsibilities. So it takes an environment of trust between management and the board. It's going to take some staffing with whatever new committee structure you come up with. So that's something. But I think the primary barrier here is what you pointed out. It's actually attitude, which is a combination of a couple things. First is, because a lot of people who are in this area, like you and I, are lawyers. And so you think about corporate governance as constitutional law for companies, and you think constitutions don't change. Well, the beauty of corporate governance is it can change and it can adapt. So part of it is you think of it as a constitution, so it's set in stone. It isn't set in stone. So that's part of it. And then the other part of it is, let's not do more than is required because, again, lawyers, risk averse. There's all sorts of scary monsters out there if we ever unleash the board and board committees in these areas. So we may create an uncontrollable beast.
Well, the phrase unintended consequences is bound to come out at some point, right?
Yeah. But if you have done a good job of recruiting good directors, right? If you have done a good job of putting in place a management team that has the right processes to address some of these transformative issues, what's the real harm of bringing the board through its committees under the tent into the decision-making process the opportunity identifying process, and not just the post hoc nanny state picking at you for having failed to do your job right management world.
Now, what I've seen, I think you and I have seen up close is, someone comes up with an idea of, you know what, we're thinking of another committee, and immediately there's this knee-jerk reaction of, no more committees. We have enough committees, forget it.
Yeah.
What's going on there? Like, why is there such a knee-jerk reaction to this?
I think part of it is the size of boards and the workload of boards, right? And so, boards shrunk when I got into this. You often had a 15 or 16 person board, and now they're more like 10 or 11. This is in public companies. So fewer directors. And so to populate board committees, no one can really be on more than a couple. If you put them on all three, what's the point of having the committees, right? So you've got a board capacity issue, plus you've got staff capacity issue. So there's a hesitance to sort of add new committees just because of the size of the board and how many committees they can serve on. And I would say that given that 74% of the S&P 500 actually already have more than 3 committees, 30-some% I think actually have 4 committees. So you actually already have more than 3 committees. So you've proven, S&P 500, you have the capacity to have more than 3 committees. A lot of you have proven that you've got the capacity to do more than that. Maybe you do add a director or 2 to help manage the workload. You've proven you got the capacity. So let's take that capacity and apply it more efficiently. Let's cut back. Let's meet all the regulatory requirements, but let's cut back on some of the other things that you just talked about, Doug. Like, give me a report on all the people who overspent their T&E. Okay, well, that may not be the best use of a board committee's or board's time. Not saying you don't do it at all, but maybe it's more important for them to sit down and actually talk about how artificial intelligence is going to transform their workforce.
Well, I guess it's like any kind of filling someone's plate with work, right? It's kind of like, okay, you're going to add something. Well, let's think about something that we really could stop doing, or maybe we just shouldn't be doing anymore because it's kind of a waste of smart people's time.
Yeah.
Time, I think, is one thing that really stops people. They're thinking of, okay, well, the board comes in for one full day, and we don't have enough time unless we start meeting at night. And we don't want to. We don't have to want to drag this into 2 days. Or other boards, we don't want to drag it from 2 days to 3 days. So I think there's kind of this like logistical mindset of, we have to get it done within this time frame.
Yeah, and look, those are real. They're valid questions and concerns, but I think part of it is, how do you structure the board's time to get the most out of it? And you may need to spend a little more time. So the way I think about this is, if you're a company, as many companies are, that are going to go through a period of transformation, the business as usual governance structure may not help you adapt to this transformative time for your company, whether it's driven by technology or economy or demographics or environmental issues or social issues, whatever it might be, right? If you're going through this transformative period, you don't necessarily want business as usual governance, right? You want to make sure you got the right committees. So it might be for all those companies that have executive committees, maybe they don't have the executive committee serve as sort of a dress rehearsal for the board or a committee that acts just in lieu of the board. Maybe they repurpose that executive committee to be a bit more like a strategy committee. And right now, our biggest strategic issue is X. So the executive committee, which has representatives from all the other committees, plus a couple other directors on it, is going to tackle that, to give forged consensus, to give pre-review before it goes to the board. Like, you can repurpose some of your existing committees and make them more meaningful.
Yeah, but I think that, what you and I know, kind of the dirty little secret here, is that most people don't know that these executive committees generally don't meet. When you ask companies like, oh yeah, we have an executive committee, but we don't meet unless there's something we need to like approve in between meetings or something like that, then we'll do it. And even if we're doing that, we're just ratifying. So, we're not actually taking action that people don't generally agree with already.
Right. And To address the time question is, if you don't devote the time now, let's take generative AI, to address what it means for your business, then there's a really good chance your board is going to be meeting 15 or 20 times a year in a few years to figure out how do you scramble back and take this incumbent company and make it relevant in a time a few years too late when you're in crisis mode. Because you're going to be meeting a lot if you're being bought by someone else. You're going to be meeting a lot if you're not meeting your numbers, right? So investing some more time now in enlisting your board as a strategic thought partner to get ahead of these transformative topics and even some of the more day-to-day topics is going to save you time later on. I mean, you just look at the records of companies that have undergone crises, and you see how many times they met in the weeks and months after a crisis appears, right? It's off the charts. And wouldn't it have been better to spread some of those meetings out earlier to get ahead of those issues?
Yeah, yeah. You talked about a lot of companies, I forget what percentage you said, have more than 3 committees. I think the number you cited was surprisingly high to me, based on kind of my, outdated knowledge. What are like the most common ones?
Yeah. The most common ones are, and the numbers are, this is as of mid-2023, and this data come from public disclosures that were digested by the conference board. So 74% of the S&P 500 had more than 3 committees, 36% had 4, 21% had 5, and 13% had 6. So what are the common other committees? The most common other committees are executive, finance, and risk. And risk is required for a lot of financial institutions.
Yeah, I'd say I don't count those. That's padding your stats.
Yeah, and some of those, as you said, don't necessarily meet.
Well, they don't meet, or they're required, if you're a bank or an insurance company, yeah, you're required to have a risk committee. So again, I don't think that counts.
They certainly count in helping, but they don't necessarily address these areas that we're talking about of core business strategy, which again, does rest as almost everything does ultimately with the board. But wouldn't it be nice to give the board a helping hand at the committee level? So you are seeing some other committees crop up. You're seeing committees focused on public policy. At some committees, like your former one, you'll have ones on R&D or science or technology, some on sustainability. But it is a bit of a hodgepodge. And I do think what's missing, and this is something I've been thinking about for a few years, is why not at least have a temporary strategy committee?
Yeah, kind of every 3 years or something like that.
Yeah.
At J&J, we did have like this science and technology committee, and I see that a lot with companies in the healthcare space or technology. I guess the criticism there from board members is, well, should this committee even exist? This is just kind of like a show and tell dog and pony show for new stuff. And it's like, well, it doesn't have to be that.
Right.
Let's think more strategically, or let's talk about more strategic stuff.
So let's think about, what is the value of this committee? Is it to review stuff before it goes to the board for a decision? Well, maybe not. Is it there to provide heightened oversight because you have people there and you want to make sure that your science is done in a responsible manner? So maybe that's their responsibility. Are there big issues to debate? Do they help to forge consensus? Or does that committee actually give that committee some decision-making power, right? Like, you could, maybe not, it's up to you. But I think part of it is it's the lack of clarity of thinking about, where does this committee add value? And if the committee's charter just uses the word review, or oversee, my guess is you haven't thought it through really clearly, like how that committee is going to add value.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to kind of the people who want to see more and more in the proxy statement. They want to hear about stuff about risk. They're never asking for things about strategy. One of the committees that I think every company should have is some kind of public policy committee. We talk so much about, in today's day and age, especially in the United States, the uncertainty of how the government's going to behave is like our number one concern. Tariffs, government wanting to take 5% of our company all of a sudden, these kind of things. It's like, okay, well, shouldn't, do you guys talk about this at the board more than like once a year? That kind of thing.
Right. And so that's an area. Some companies do have those. Sometimes they fold them into nom and gov. Sometimes it's governance, corporate responsibilities, public policy. It can go in a number of places. But yeah, again, if you're thinking about the areas where the company acts, marketplace, workplace, and public space, it's a miss if you don't have anyone looking at it's not just your corporate political activity, like your PAC contributions, right? Which again is relatively narrow, but it probably should be looking more at what the government can do to you and what you might be able to do to influence the government. That really is, mission critical. So for example, when I worked at Time Warner, Dick Parsons used to say, we could compete against any of the big media companies out there, Disney or Viacom or any out there. He said the only thing we really have to worry about is the government. Because compared to the government, like we're a little VW bug and they're a big old bus and they can just drive us off the road.
Yeah, no one has more leverage than the government. Yeah.
The government can affect everything you do. It can affect why you exist. It can affect your purpose. It can make your purpose illegal. It can affect your strategy. It can affect where you carry out the strategy. It can affect how you report on the execution of your strategy. It can also affect whom you're serving by executing your strategy. So absolutely every aspect of a company can be touched and affected by the government.
Yeah. Anything else that you wanted to cover or highlight?
Yeah, so the thing I would say is, this sounds like a lot of work to go, oh gosh, we got to go and look at everything a committee could do, and we really don't want to, go through this exercise. Well, at the end of the day, you may not wind up doing a complete overhaul of your committee structure, right? You may say, you know what, we're going to make a few tweaks. We're going to clarify a few things about this committee. Maybe we'll set up an occasional strategy committee. So you may not make a major overhaul here. But what you might do in the process here is figure out the things that the full board ought to be doing, right? So if you realize that there are activities that you're engaging in the marketplace, the review of your products and services, your supply chain, or your operations, and you realize, you know what? We don't necessarily want a committee of the board focusing on it, but maybe the board ought to focus on it a little bit more. So the end product here may be changing your committee charters, changing the processes, but it might also just be what you do differently at the board level to engage the board at the board level as more of a strategic thought partner in executing your company's strategy. And that's, I think, worthwhile, even if that's the end result of this sort of analysis, because you do have to look at the board and committees together. So I do think committees can play an important role here, but the end result of all of this might just be, you know what? We're going to take a fresh look at delineating the board's responsibilities. And in light of this fresh look at the board's responsibilities, we're going to be providing them with more meaningful agendas, more valuable briefing materials, and resulting in more engaging and constructive and value-adding discussions at the board level. So although I've tucked this in this chapter on committees, I think what could really happen after this is a rethinking of the role of the board.
Yeah, so you bring up two really great points here. One is that it kind of goes both ways, that in addition to thinking about what at the board could be, focused on at the committee level, you're also thinking about what kind of things at the committee level really should be full board issues. And the other point you bring up, which I know a lot of people hate, is just going through this process every once in a while is good hygiene, as they would say, even if you arrive at the same outcome.
Yes.
It's like we've done the work and we decided that we don't need to make any changes. Just the fact that you didn't make any changes doesn't mean the whole thing was a waste of time. Because, confirming something every once in a while there's value there.
It's just fine. In fact, but the confirmation may also involve clarification, because you may say, after having gone through all this, you know what? We don't have a board with the capabilities, at least right now, to add value in these areas. We just want management to do it. And that makes it quite clear what we expect management to do, right? So that in and of itself can be of some value. And the thing I'd say you need to have to do this, you need obviously support of the CEO. You need the governance professionals, corporate secretary, general counsel, who can undertake this. But what's really critical here is, I think, having a nom and gov committee chair or lead independent director who's going to say, this is worth doing. And it's not just because we want to optimize our committees. This has a knock-on effect. This has a knock-on effect on the board. It has a knock-on effect of the board agendas, the materials the board receives, the board's purpose, right? And how the board spends its time. So I think if people feel like, having gone through these board self-evaluations every year, that we're still missing something, we're still not optimizing the value of the board, this committee review process could really help.
Paul, thank you for joining us. That concludes this episode of the Public Company Series podcast powered by Onboard. I'd like to thank Paul Washington of the Society for Corporate Governance for sharing his insights on board committees today. And I encourage you to read Paul's chapter entitled Balancing Workload and Responsibility of the Board and its Committees, which you can find in the book, Board Structure and Composition, part of the Public Company Series published by the New York Stock Exchange and JP Morgan. You can read and download the entire book at nyse.com/PCS. To learn more about Onboard, visit onboardmeetings.com. For additional resources and episodes, visit publiccompanyseries.com. And don't forget to subscribe to receive all new episodes of the Public Company Series podcast, and rate us and leave a review. I'm Doug Chia, and we will see you next time.